Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. It was nearly 10 years ago that a bright September day was darkened by the worst attack on the American people in our history. The images of 9/11 are seared into our national memory. Hijacked planes cutting through a cloudless September sky, the Twin Towers collapsing to the ground, black smoke billowing up from the Pentagon, the wreckage of Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the actions of heroic citizens saved even more heartbreak and destruction. And yet we know that the worst images are those that were unseen.
September 11th, 2001 was the day that America will remember forever. This was the day that a terrorist group named Al-Qaeda attacked three major U.S. icons. The first target was the World Trade Center in New York City. This symbolizes U.S. economic power. The second target was the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. This symbolizes U.S. military power. The third target was the White House in Washington, D.C., and that would symbolize the U.S. political power. Luckily, the passengers in the plane that was attacking the White House were able to attack the hijackers and bring the plane down to avoid hitting the White House and killing more innocent people. It landed on a farm in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Terrorists wanted to attack these major buildings because U.S. military, economic, and political power influences people all around the world.
Terrorists from Al-Qaeda chose September 11th to perform the attacks because that was when the Camp David Accords were signed. This was when Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty that officially established Israel as a state. Islamic extremists blamed the U.S. for helping Israel. Even though the attacks lasted only a couple hours, there is a lot of long history that leads up to this event. An Islamic extremist named Osama bin Laden was the mastermind behind all of this and was the leader of Al-Qaeda.
There are three major reasons as to why Osama bin Laden hated the U.S. The first reason has to do with U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. During the Persian Gulf War, which was from 1989 through 1991, Saudi Arabia asked the U.S. for protection versus Saddam Hussein and Iraq. Saudi Arabia had asked the U.S. for protection because the U.S. had one of the most powerful militaries in the world. This angered Osama because the U.S. were Christians and they didn't want them on the Muslim land. This especially angered Osama because Mecca and Medina were the two holy cities in Islam and they were being inhabited by Christians.
The second reason to Osama's hatred was the U.S. support of Israel. First of all, Islamic extremists believe that Israel oppresses Palestinian Muslims and took Muslim land. This means that Israel treated the Muslim in an unfair way. In addition, Islamic extremists know that the U.S. always supported Israel no matter what. Clearly, you can see why this would upset other Muslims.
The third and final reason as to why Osama bin Laden hated the U.S. was because of the sanctions and bombings of Iraq. A sanction prohibits one country to trade with another country in order to make it weak. The U.S. and the UN believe that the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction. In order to take control of this situation, sanctions were placed on Iraq. Unfortunately, these sanctions killed many civilians but did not hurt Saddam Hussein. This made Osama annoyed because the U.S. was just killing innocent civilians and it did nothing to help the problem at hand.
Osama bin Laden was part of the Mujahideen. These were the people from all over the world who went to Afghanistan to fight for Islam in the Soviet-Afghan War. Later in history, this group split up into the Taliban, which is the government of Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's job was to recruit people to fight for Islam. Osama bin Laden was a well-respected member of Al-Qaeda. As Osama bin Laden's hatred grew for America, so did the members of Al-Qaeda. In order to understand how Al-Qaeda became the way it is, we need to go back in history. It begins with the Cold War, which lasted from 1949 to 1989. This was an ideological war that was fought between the U.S. and the USSR based on their form of government, which was democracy from the United States and communism from the USSR. A part of the war was nicknamed the Arms Race. The Arms Race was when the two countries tried to develop better nuclear weapons, and more effective delivery systems. Some types of bombs that were used are the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb. Delivery system included planes, missiles, and eventually space. This led to another part of the Cold War titled the Space Race. After the U.S. and the USSR competed to have the most powerful bomb, they competed to have the most effective delivery system of the bombs. The two countries developed space programs to allow them to use the nuclear weapons easier. For example, they could drop the bomb from using a satellite. As both countries were advancing in this race, they each accomplished amazing feats. The USSR were able to put the first man in space, however the US was able to put the first man on the moon. The Cold War was continuing and the two countries fought in battles called the proxy wars. These are wars fought in smaller countries with support of US or USSR. The proxy wars include the Korean War, 1950 through 1953, the Vietnam War, 1954 through 1975, and the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 through 1988. The Soviet-Afghan War was another reason behind the origins of Al-Qaeda. This is when the USSR tried to make Afghanistan communist. The Afghani people obviously revolted because they were Muslim and they didn't want to be communist. The Afghani people received help from the Muslims from all over the world to fight for Islam. These people are called Mujahideen. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, was a part of the Mujahideen. The CIA began to help Mujahideen by giving them training, money, and weapons to help fight the USSR. The Mujahideen used guerrilla-style warfare, which includes ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. This all paid off in the end because the USSR could not defeat them, and in 1988, they left Afghanistan. Most importantly, Mujahideen believed that they won the war because God was on their side. They truly thought that they can defeat anyone and anything. After the war, Mujahideen split into two: Al-Qaeda, whose job was to recruit people to fight for Islam, and the Taliban, which was the government of Afghanistan. Following the split up of Mujahideen, the USSR fell in 1989. This meant that they split up into two separate countries. The Mujahideen believed that they destroyed a superpower. The Persian Gulf War, also known as the First Iraq War, was in 1990 through 1991. Iraq was under Saddam Hussein's power and they invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia desperately needed help, so they asked the U.S. to help fight. Osama bin Laden was distributed to find out that Saudi Arabia asked the U.S. to help fight because he hoped that they would ask Mujahideen. When the U.S. sent troops to Saudi Arabia, bin Laden turned on the U.S. This is when attacks on Americas began. It started with the 1993 World Trader bombing. A man named Ramzi Youssef plotted an attack on the Twin Towers. His plan was to load a truck with explosives and take down both towers. Fortunately, he did not have enough bombs, but it killed 6 people and over 1,000 were injured.
The pre-9/11 attack was in 1994 in Somalia. They were having a severe famine. In order to help, the U.S. and UN wanted to send food. However, local warlords in Somalia controlled the food and exploited people. The U.S. and UN put troops in Somalia to help give food to the civilians. Al-Qaeda came in to help the local warlords fight the U.S. troops. During this battle, they shot down a Black Hawk helicopter. This action killed 19 U.S. troops. The U.S. realized that it was no longer safe to stay in Somalia, so they pulled out. As a reaction to this, Al-Qaeda began to tease the U.S. as paper tigers. This infers that they look tough on the outside, but they are actually flimsy and vulnerable on the inside. The attacks on the U.S. didn't stop here. In 1998, the U.S. embassies of Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. Even though the embassies are physically in a different country, they are technically on U.S. soil. As a result of these unfortunate bombings by Al-Qaeda, 223 people died and over 4,000 were injured. The last attack that Al-Qaeda did on the U.S. before 9/11 was the 2000 USS Cole bombing. This is when a small ship full of explosives and suicide bombers attacked a Navy ship off the coast of Yemen. 9/11 attacks made the U.S. aware of the dangers of Al-Qaeda. They just wanted to know why Al-Qaeda hated the U.S. with such a passion. The fifth reason to the origins of Al-Qaeda is the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It started in World War I. It was Great Britain, France, and the U.S. versus Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. During the war, Great Britain needed the help of European Jewish scientists. In return for helping them, Great Britain promised the Jews their own state in Palestine after the war. Great Britain also needed the help of Palestinian Arabs to help fight the Ottoman Empire. However, they promised them the same land as the Jews. This was a big problem because two very different types of people would have to share the land. In 1918, the war ended and Britain won.
The Jews started moving to Palestine land in 1918 through 1939. They were excited to have their own
World
land.
War II took place in 1939 through 1945. During this war was the Holocaust. This was when 12 million people were murdered. 6 million were Jews. The survivors of the Holocaust had nowhere to go, so the US, UN, and Great Britain decided to give them a state in Palestine. In 1948, the State of Israel was established. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Palestinians fought Israel for the land. Israel won the war easily because they worked together and they had better weapons. These countries didn't stop fighting Israel. In 1967, there was a 6-day war. Arab states tried to fight Israel again, but Israel beat them with no harm done. Extremists began to use terrorism instead of conventional war. Through the 1970s and 80s, they inflicted hijackings and suicide bombings against Israel and the United States. On September 11, 1978, was the Camp David Accords. This is when Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. This event officially established Israel as a state. This day was very important for Al-Qaeda, so they chose to perform the attacks on the World Trade Center on this day. Islamic extremists blamed U.S. for helping Israel 9/11, which marked a new war on terror. Shortly after the attacks had happened, United States intelligence had uncovered that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were the minds of this horrible event. The government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, had been supplying and assisting them and providing shelter as well. This ultimately led to the U.S. invading Afghanistan, and they stayed there from 2001 through 2012. When the U.S. troops left Afghanistan, they left something in their place to continue fighting back. They had begun to replace manpower with drones, which could be controlled and programmed to find terrorists and kill them. This was a good idea, but too many innocent civilians were killed because they were confused with terrorists, and this angered people even more. During this time, the Second Iraq War started from 2003 through 2010, and this was also when the U.S. began to help rebuild Iraq. In this war, Saddam Hussein was killed and taken out of power because the U.S. believed he possessed weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorism. After the U.S. had removed Saddam Hussein, they could begin rebuilding things in Iraq, such as barracks and hospitals. In America, 9/11 made the recession worse. Billions of dollars were spent in security for airplanes. This took away from education costs and social services. Also, the airline industry almost collapsed because no one wanted to go on an airplane anymore. Many small terrorist acts continued in the wake of 9/11. In 2001, an attempted shoe bomb plot was foiled. Richard Reed had tried to light a bomb in his shoe, but he had sweated so much that the gunpowder was unable to light. In 2006, a transatlantic plot was foiled. Several men had planned to use peroxide-based liquid explosives, but these were unsuccessful. A last bomb was attempted in 2009 and is referred to as the underwear bomb. This is why full-body pat-downs are now necessary. Throughout the United States, there is now an anti-Arab/Muslim sentiment, and there are many attacks on people from the Middle East. As an example of this is the 2012 attack on a Sikh temple. There is an idea now that people associate all Muslims with Islamic extremists. There are over 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, but Islamic extremists only make up less than 1% of them. All of this leads to another very important day in history, May 2nd, 2011. This is when Navy SEAL Team 6 located and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan after he was hiding for many years. September 11th, 2001 is a day in American history that has a special place in our hearts. We will never forget the heroes on that day and the loved ones of thousands of people. It was a terribly unfortunate event. However, it made our country come together as a whole and truly be a union. Of course, we all wish we can go back in time and erase this from our past, but in reality, some positive outcomes came from this. For example, we have intense security throughout the country, and now we are more safe. As you have just seen, 9/11 didn't just happen. Events spanning many years led to 9/11. As Rudolph Giuliano once said, the attacks of September 11th were intended to break our spirit. Instead, we have emerged stronger and more unified. We are more determined than ever to live our lives in freedom.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.